The teacher's name was Vos3R11, and it had been lecturing the same cohort of young Veth for the better part of a planetary cycle. The classroom was not a room in any human sense. It was a pressure-sealed membrane stretched across the interior of Observation Node 7, positioned at the geostationary point above the third moon of Karathroman 4. The membrane pulsed faintly with bioluminescent instruction data, and the 32 student forms that clung to its inner surface absorbed the information through their ventral adhesion pads. Vos3R11 moved between them the way a slow current moves through deep water, unhurried, complete, leaving a faint chemical signature of authority in its wake. The lesson was predation management. Sixth cycle students, post-molting, theoretically ready for galactic survey work. Today, Vos3R11 announced, its resonance organs producing a frequency range that the translation matrix in the node's ceiling rendered as something like speech. We will catalog the known predator classifications of the inner arm survey regions. You will memorize response protocols for each. Failure to internalize these protocols resulted, in the last cycle alone, in the loss of 4 survey crews and 1 full colonial assessment team. The membrane rippled as the students adjusted their grip. Classification 1, the teacher continued. The Gret Spikers of Yanomaru, ambush predators, bilateral symmetry, attack vector is overhead. Standard evasion, low profile scatter formation activate suit opacity, simple. A student whose designation roughly translated as the one who asks too many questions raised one of its manipulator limbs. Instructor, what about the Terran predator classes? My cycle parent said there was a new entry in the Survey Incident Codex. We will address Terrans in the advanced curriculum, Vos3R11 said, and the chemical signature it left was one that older Veth recognized instantly as the smell of a subject being changed. Classification 2, the Maw Beasts of Drell. But instructor, said another student, a smaller form near the membrane's apex, one whose translucent carapace still showed the pink-green of recent growth. I heard a Terran survey crew was operating on Kethara 9 during the Krat beetle migration. I heard they survived. The membrane went very still. Vos3R11 moved toward the small student slowly. It was a movement the older Veth would have recognized as the kind that precedes a correction, but the student held its position, which was either bravery or ignorance, and at that age the two were often indistinguishable. Where did you hear this? The maintenance Veth who cleans the outer node. He said his hatch brother was on Kethara 9 as part of the environmental survey support team. He said the Terran crew was advised to evacuate before the migration. He said they stayed. And the maintenance Veth's hatch brother reported that the Terrans walked out the other side, all 7 of them, and one of the Krat beetle colonies was, he said the word the Terrans used was relocated. The membrane was very quiet now. Even the bioluminescent instruction data had dimmed, the way a light dims when something larger than the room enters the room. Vos3R11 let the silence sit for precisely as long as it needed to. That account, it said finally, is either exaggerated, misremembered, or the product of deliberate Terran disinformation. The Krat beetles of Kethara 9 are a classification 9 predator cluster. They hunt in swarms of no fewer than 4,000 individuals. Their exoskeletal acid spray has a dispersal radius of 11 meters and will dissolve standard survey-grade polymer shielding in under 40 seconds. They do not have natural predators on Kethara 9. There is no protocol for surviving sustained contact with a Class 9 swarm. There is only the evacuation protocol and the incident report that follows it. The small student's adhesion pads flexed once, twice. But the Terrans are classified, Vos3R11 said, as a Class 2 provisional biological entity, tool-using, bipedal, short-lived fragile atmospheric requirements, no natural thermal protection, no venom, no natural body armor, extremely limited sensory range. They survive in space through the use of constructed technology, which any survey-capable species does. They are not remarkable. Then why, asked the one who asks too many questions, very quietly, is there a locked file in the Survey Incident Codex specifically for them? The membrane shivered. Vosthren R11 did not answer immediately. What it said eventually was, Classification 2, the Maw Beasts of Drell, Distributed Ambush Formation, Attack Vector is Subsurface, Standard Evasion. But the damage, as the old Veth saying went, had already been done to the water. The locked file in the Survey Incident Codex was designated Terran Contact Series, and it had 47 entries. Incident Report 1 was brief. A Veth Advanced Survey team on a marginal atmosphere world had encountered a lone Terran whose transit vessel had suffered catastrophic decompression. The Terran had been on the surface for 19 standard hours by the time the Veth team found it. The survey team's report was clinical. The Terran was alive, dehydrated. One limb appeared fractured. It had constructed a basic shelter from the debris of its vessel and had, improbably, started a combustion-based heat source using components of its own life support system. The survey team had offered emergency stabilization. The Terran had refused until it confirmed, through 17 separate communications, that its vessel's data core had been secured. It had then lost consciousness for 3 hours, woken up, consumed a significant quantity of what the Veth medic described as a brown liquid it appeared to have synthesized from ship rations, and asked whether the survey team had a spare welding rig. The Veth medic's addendum read, Entity demonstrated no recognition that its situation had been life-threatening. When I noted that 19 hours on a marginal atmosphere world with a fractured limb and no life support was statistically unsurvivable, the entity said, quote, "Yeah, it was pretty rough." Then it asked me to hand it a wrench. Incident Report 7 concerned a mining outpost on a Class Delta asteroid in a contested belt region. The outpost had been attacked by a pack of Grell stalkers, 6 of them, large variants, the kind that had depopulated the Shenar colony on asteroid K445 without leaving enough biological material for identification. The 4-person Terran crew had been conducting a routine ore assessment. The Grell stalkers had cornered them in the processing bay. The incident report had been filed by a Keth survey drone that had been mapping the belt when it picked up the outpost's distress signal and redirected to investigate. The drone's log recorded the following, in sequence. The distress signal, a significant period of what the drone's audio sensors classified as high-energy structural events, consistent with industrial equipment being used in non-standard ways, a cessation of Grell stalker bioelectric signatures, and then one Terran emerging from the processing bay's secondary access, hatch covered in what subsequent analysis identified as a mixture of molten or slag, hydraulic fluid, and Grell stalker ichor. The Terran had looked directly at the survey drone. It had said, "You got a medical kit. My buddy Marco took a hit." Marco survived. The Grell stalkers did not. The Keth survey drone's subsequent analysis of the processing bay, conducted after the Terran crew had been evacuated and treated, found that the 4 humans had, over the course of approximately 90 minutes, improvised a series of weapons from mining equipment, rerouted the outpost's thermal processing vents to create localized high-heat zones, and used the ore conveyor system as a mobile platform to deny the Grell stalkers consistent ground contact. One of the Grell stalkers appeared to have been defeated primarily by a human throwing a very large wrench at very high velocity from a very short distance with what the structural analysis suggested was considerable force. The analysis was appended with a note from the reviewing Keth archivist. These are not behaviors consistent with a Class 2 provisional classification. Recommend review. The review was never completed. Incident Report 23 was the one that had been discussed at 3 separate sessions of the Galactic Survey Coordination Committee before being quietly moved to the locked file. It concerned a world called Cathara 9. The crew of the GSS Borealis were not heroes. This is important to establish. Dario Reyes had been an asteroid miner for 11 years. Before that, he'd worked a fishing boat out of a small coastal city. Before that, he'd been a mechanic's apprentice. He was 34 years old, average height, slightly too broad in the shoulders for standard-issue survey suits, which meant his left shoulder seam was always one bad day from giving out. He had a small tattoo on his right forearm of a hummingbird that his daughter had designed when she was 7 years old. She had drawn it on a napkin. He'd had it inked 3 days later. He carried a photograph of her and her mother in his helmet's inner pocket, not in his suit's data storage, where it would survive vacuum, but in his physical helmet pocket where it couldn't. When his crewmate Delors had pointed this out, he'd said, "I know. That's why I'm careful with the helmet." The Borealis was a Class 4 survey and extraction vessel, underfunded, overworked, crewed by 7 people who had learned over 18 months of close quarters to navigate each other's bad moods, good jokes, and specific food preferences with the precision of a well-drilled team. They were not trained soldiers. They were not explorers in the classic sense. They were workers, the way most people who go into space are workers, because there's money in it, because the company needs bodies with the right certifications, because the alternative is staying groundside and watching someone else get the hazard pay. Their assignment on Cathara 9 was supposed to be simple. 3-day atmospheric and geological survey, standard pre-colonial assessment package. The planet had been flagged as a potential agricultural development site by a Terran colonial expansion consortium. The VETH survey data, purchased through the Interspecies Survey Exchange, had assessed the planet as class habitable marginal, breathable atmosphere, tolerable temperature range, presence of complex fauna warranting observation protocols. What the VETH survey data had not adequately conveyed, because the VETH surveyor who had filed it had been on Cathara 9 during the northern winter when the krat beetles were in their dormant phase, was that the planet's primary dominant fauna, the krat beetles, went through an annual migration pattern that transformed approximately 60% of the planet's surface into an active swarm zone for 47 local days. The Borealis landed on day 3 of the migration. Dario found this out from LEONARD, their suit's integrated AI system, approximately 16 minutes after touchdown, when LEONARD's long-range sensors flagged a bioelectric signature that the system's database had no classification for and described, in the dry way that LEONARD described everything, as extensive. "How extensive?" Dario asked. "The leading edge of the bioelectric signature is currently 11 kilometers nor-northeast," LEONARD said. "The signature itself spans approximately 42 kilometers in width. Forward velocity suggests it will reach our position in..." "How long?" "90 minutes, possibly less. The wind is at our back." Dario looked at the sky, which was blue and completely ordinary looking, and thought about his daughter's hummingbird. "LEONARD," he said, "pull everything we have on Cathara 9 fauna and tell me what we're dealing with." LEONARD pulled the VETH survey data. The classification that came back was the one that the VETH Survey Coordination Committee had put in the locked file, along with 37 annotations that all, in various ways, said the same thing. Do not approach. Do not engage. Evacuate immediately. This is not a situation that can be managed with standard protocols. "They're called krat beetles in the translation approximation," LEONARD said. "Eusocial arthropod colony organism. Individual units average 0.4 meters in length. Colony units during migration number in excess of 4,000 per square kilometer. They. Acid spray. 11-meter dispersal radius. Will dissolve standard survey polymer in approximately 40 seconds. Yeah, Dario had been around long enough to have heard the stories. Pull the crew. The crew came in from the 3 survey stations they deployed around the landing site. 7 people. Priya, the geologist, still had her sample kit in her hand. Marco, the structural analyst, came in at a run with one boot still unlaced. Dolores, the atmospheric specialist, came in calm because Dolores came in calm for everything. Even the time a decompression event had nearly ejected her from the Borealis's airlock. A story she told with the same flat affect she used to discuss weather patterns and quarterly reports. Krat beetles, Dario said. Migration, 90 minutes, maybe less. Nobody panicked. This was one of the things about this crew that later reviewers of Incident Report 23 would note as unusual. Not one of the 7 panicked. Priya swore under her breath in 2 languages. Marco looked at his boot and decided, apparently, that the lacing situation was now irrelevant. Dolores said, "Leonard, show me the migration path." Leonard showed them. The migration path was a solid front moving south. The Borealis sat directly in its path. The nearest point of lateral egress, the point where they could potentially move the ship sideways out of the swarm's projected path, required a 60-kilometer drive across terrain that their survey vehicles had not yet mapped. 60 kilometers in 90 minutes in unmapped terrain was not achievable. What about straight up? Priya asked. Leonard calculated. The Borealis can achieve safe altitude in under 8 minutes. However, the colony swarm has been recorded at altitudes up to how high? 400 meters during thermal updraft events. Current atmospheric conditions support. So we can't fly over them. Not at safe altitude, no. What about under them? There was a brief silence that was, in its way, more informative than anything Leonard could have said. The Krat beetles, Leonard said carefully, are primarily surface-level organisms. They do not burrow. Their migration pattern is surface-based. However, the terrain of Cathara 9 does not present. What about the geological survey data Priya just pulled? She's been mapping the subsurface for 3 days. Priya looked at her sample kit. Then she looked at the terrain data on her wrist unit. Then she looked at Dario with an expression that was 60% calculation and 40% something that might, in a different context, have been called excitement. There are lava tubes, she said. Old ones, probably stable. The network runs, she pulled up the mapping data, tracing it with one finger, all the way from about 2 kilometers south of here to a breakout point on the eastern ridge, 11 kilometers, which puts us outside the swarm's projected path, Dolores said. If the tubes are passable. Only one way to find out. The first kilometer of the lava tube was manageable. The ceiling was high enough for upright movement in most sections. The floor was rough but navigable, and Leonard's sonar mapping kept them from walking into dead ends. They moved in a line, Dario at the front, Priya navigating behind him, then Marco, then the others, then Dolores at the rear with her atmospheric sensors running a continuous check on the air quality, which was stale and mineral-heavy but breathable. The second kilometer was where the tubes narrowed. Not impassably, but enough that they had to move single file through sections where the walls pressed close on both sides, and the ceiling dropped to 1.5 meters, which meant crouching, which meant slower progress, which meant Leonard quietly revised the arrival time estimate and did not share it until Dario specifically asked. Revised estimate puts the swarm at our original position in 63 minutes, Leonard said. We're in a tube. Yes. However, the acoustic resonance of the tube system would allow the swarm to track vibration signatures. If the colony detects concentrated biosignatures below the surface, do they know to look underground? There is no data on Krat beetle behavior. in relation to subsurface biological signatures. So that's a maybe. That is technically accurate. Dario thought about this for approximately 3 seconds, which was how long he could afford to think about it while crouching in a lava tube with 6 other people behind him, and a 4,000-unit acid-spraying swarm somewhere above. "Keep moving," he said. They kept moving. The 3rd kilometer was where they found the chamber. It was large, easily 30 meters across, with a ceiling dome that rose to 12 or 15 meters at its apex. A collapsed section of the dome's edge let in a column of gray daylight. The floor of the chamber was relatively flat, and across the chamber, clearly visible in the gray light, was a passage that Priya's mapping data confirmed connected to the tube network leading east. Between them and that passage were the Krat beetles. Not the swarm, not the migration front, a subcolony, a splinter group that had apparently found the chamber through the collapsed dome section and was currently doing what Krat beetles did when they found a warm enclosed space, which was cluster. Maybe 200 of them, dense in the center of the chamber, chittering softly in the dark. 7 humans in a 30-meter chamber with 200 Krat beetles and one way out. The crew stopped moving. Nobody spoke for several seconds. The beetles' chittering filled the chamber like static, rhythmic and constant. Marco very quietly said, "Can we go around them?" Priya studied her mapping data. "No, the chamber walls are smooth, no side passages before the exit corridor." "Can we go back?" Leonard. "The swarm front is now approximately 40 minutes from our original position. Estimated time to reach our current depth via surface collapse infiltration is variable, unknown." "So forward is the only option," Dario said. "Forward is the only option." Dario looked at the subcolony of Krat beetles. He looked at the collapsed dome section and the column of gray daylight. He looked at Marco's unlaced boot. He pulled up Leonard's data on Krat beetle sensory systems. They navigated primarily by vibration and chemical signature. Their chemical signal network was sophisticated. It was how the migration swarm maintained cohesion across 4,000 individuals per square kilometer. A disruption to the chemical signal field would, theoretically, disrupt coordinated behavior. A sufficiently overwhelming external signal could, theoretically, trigger an alarm scatter response, but only if the colony units interpreted the external signal as a threat greater than whatever they were currently doing. "Dolores," Dario said. "Yeah. Your atmospheric sensors, what can they emit?" Dolores looked at her sensor pack. "Passive collection array, spectrometer, thermal," she paused. "The spectrometer has a focused emission mode. It's designed for atmospheric particulate sampling, but in focused mode it can pump out a pretty tight beam chemical signal at. Could you make it smell like a predator?" Dolores looked at him, then she looked at the beetles, then she looked back at him. "I'd need to know what a Krat beetle predator smells like." Leonard. "There is no data on natural Krat beetle predators on Cathara 9, Leonard said. However, the VETH survey biochemistry data includes." A pause. "A note that the standard VETH survey team alarm scatter protocol for Class 9 swarms includes the use of a synthesized pheromone derived from Yanamaru apex predator secretions, which the VETH determined through cross-referencing the Krat beetle's evolutionary biochemistry with." "Does that data include the chemical formula?" "Yes." "Can Dolores's spectrometer synthesize it?" Given the available chemical precursors in Dolores's sensor pack and approximately 4 minutes of preparation time. "We have 40 minutes. "Then yes, with significant confidence." Dario looked at Dolores. Dolores was already unclipping her sensor pack, pulling up the spectrometer's emission settings, her face the same calm that it always was, the same calm she'd had during the decompression event. The same calm she apparently brought to all situations up to and including standing 30 meters from 200 acid-spraying arthropods in a hole in the ground. 4 minutes, she said. Everyone stay still. They stayed still. The beetles chittered. 4 minutes is a long time when you are being asked to be very quiet. Dario could hear his own breathing. He could hear Marco's boots scraping very slightly against the floor when Marco shifted his weight, and he made a sharp cutting gesture with one hand and Marco went completely still and stayed that way. He could hear Priya running silent calculations on her wrist unit's haptic interface. He could hear, from somewhere above and to the north, a sound like weather, like a heavy rain that hadn't started yet but was close, which was not weather. Ready, Dolores said. Where do you need to aim it? The colony's chemical communication network operates on a diffusion gradient. I need to hit the center of the cluster and let it propagate outward. If I'm right about the concentration, they should interpret it as a large Yanimaru apex predator entering the chamber from, she calculated briefly, from the dome collapse side, which is directly above them. And then they scatter. And then they scatter. If it works. If it doesn't work. Dolores considered this with the expression of a person who has already decided not to waste time on the parts of a problem she can't solve. Then we run, she said. Toward the exit, Dario confirmed. Toward the exit, she agreed. She fired the spectrometer. The effect was not immediate. For approximately 3 seconds, nothing happened. The beetles continued their soft chittering. Dario's hand was on the wall of the tube. He could feel his own pulse in his fingertips. Then the center of the cluster went silent. The silence spread outward from the center like a ripple, one ring of beetles going quiet. Then the next, a wave of silence that moved through the colony in less than 2 seconds, and when it reached the outer edge of the cluster, the beetles moved. They moved fast, faster than anything that size had any right to move, a sudden explosive scatter that sent them in every direction simultaneously, not toward the humans, not toward the exit passage, but toward every crack and crevice in the chamber walls, toward the floor, toward the far edges of the dome, away from the center where the chemical signal was strongest, away from the perceived apex predator that their ancient biochemistry was screaming at them to flee from. The sound was extraordinary, a wave of chittering that rose to a peak, and then suddenly fragmented into dozens of separate streams of noise as the colony dispersed. Within 40 seconds, the center of the chamber was empty. Not entirely. There were stragglers at the edges, individuals that hadn't caught the full chemical signal or whose individual threat assessment had resolved differently from the colony's. Maybe 20 of them at the walls, at the floor, confused and agitated, not scattering but not clustering either. Move, Dario said. Center line, don't get close to the walls, move now. They moved. The 7 of them crossed the chamber in a line, not running. Running would have triggered the vibration-sensitive panic scatter response, and a reverse scatter would have brought the beetles back toward the center, but walking fast, measured steps, Dario counting them off under his breath, watching the stragglers at the walls, watching the stragglers track the human's passage with the flat, expressionless attention of things that don't have faces. One of the stragglers moved toward them. Dolores, without breaking stride, adjusted the spectrometer's beam to a narrow, focused pulse and hit the beetle directly. It stopped. It reversed direction. It went back to the wall. They walked into the exit passage. Nobody spoke until they were 50 meters into the tube. Then Marco said, breathlessly and with considerable feeling, several words in a row that were not technically language but communicated clearly. Yeah, said Priya. Keep moving, said Dario. They kept moving. The eastern breakout point was a narrow fissure in the ridge face, roughly a kilometer from the edge of the swarm's projected path. They emerged into afternoon light. Behind them, to the north and west, the migration front was visible on the horizon, not individual beetles, at this distance, but a shimmering darkness that moved like weather, like a tide, like something that had not learned the word for obstacle because it had never needed to. The Borealis was somewhere in the middle of it. Dario stood at the fissure mouth and looked at where their ship was, and then he looked at his crew, and then he looked back at the swarm. "Elio and ARD," he said. "Yes." "The Borealis, what's her status?" "The vessel's outer hull is survey-grade polymer. As discussed, Krat beetle acid spray will dissolve survey-grade polymer in 40 seconds per square meter of exposure. I know. How long before the swarm clears the ship's position?" The migration front's velocity and breadth suggest the swarm will transit the Borealis's position in approximately. Elio and ARD paused with the particular pause of a system calculating something it would prefer not to calculate. 41 hours. 7 people, 11 kilometers from the Borealis. On a planet whose primary food chain had just washed over their only transport. 41 hours until the swarm moved on. Standard protocol. Activate emergency beacon, await rescue, shelter in place. Dario had already thought through standard protocol. Rescue from the nearest Terran facility was a minimum of 63 hours. The eastern ridge had no shelter structures, no independent atmosphere processing, no food or water beyond what was in their suit reserves, which were rated for 12 hours. The math was not good. He sat down on a rock at the fissure mouth and looked at the swarm and thought about it. The rest of the crew sat down around him, because that was what you did. You sat down, you rested while you could, you let your brain work without making it carry your body at the same time. It was Priya who said it, eventually. She said it the way she said most things, which was with the precision of a person who had learned that imprecision in her field could end careers or lives. "The tubes," she said, "the lava tube network. We mapped 11 kilometers to get here, but the network doesn't end here. The survey data shows," she pulled it up, tracing it, "the network extends. There's a major chamber system approximately 2 kilometers below the swarm's surface path. The tubes connect. If we can get ahead of the swarm." "How far ahead of the swarm do we need to be?" "The swarm's migration path has a southern terminus. Projected terminus based on the VETH migration data is approximately 40 kilometers south of the Borealis. If we can move through the tube system to a point south of the terminus, we come up behind the swarm. We come up behind the swarm. And then we walk back to the ship. And then we walk back to the ship." Dario thought about this. "How long is that route?" "Probably 32 kilometers, through unmapped tube sections." "Probably." "There's a margin of error." "How big a margin?" Priya looked at him steadily. "Significant." "But doable." She looked at the swarm on the horizon. She looked at her suit reserves indicator. She looked at the mapping data on her wrist unit. She was doing the thing she always did, which was building a complete picture of a problem before she committed to an answer, which was why her answers were usually right. "Doable," she said. Marco laced his boot. Nobody commented on this, but everyone noticed. "Let's go," Dario said. The deep tubes were different from the upper network. They were older, for one thing, the geological formations more extreme, the walls bearing the evidence of volcanic events so ancient that Priya kept stopping to take samples, and then stopping herself from stopping because they didn't have time for samples. The ceiling was generally higher, which was better. The floor was frequently uneven in ways that the surface mapping had not resolved, which was worse. Elio and ARD's sonar worked in fits and starts. In some sections of the deep tube network, the geological density blocked sonar entirely, and they navigated by the mapping data Priya was building in real time from her ground-penetrating sensor, which gave them maybe 20 meters of reliable advance notice and required her to keep her eyes on the wrist display constantly. They moved in silence, mostly. Not from discipline, but from a kind of shared understanding that this was not a situation that benefited from commentary. The tubes amplified sound. The beetles somewhere above them, the swarm's vibration registered as a low, constant tremor through the rock, a sound more felt than heard, were potentially sensitive to that amplified sound or potentially not, and it seemed better not to test it. Dario led. He led the way he'd always led, which was not by declaring himself the leader, but simply by being the person who moved first when moving was required, who stopped first when stopping was required, who made the call when a call needed to be made, and then moved on without dwelling on the making of it. He'd been doing this his whole life without a name for it. First on fishing boats where you learned fast who you could follow into bad weather, then on mining crews where the calculus was the same. You found the person whose judgment you trusted when everything was wrong, and you followed them, and they led. And it was not complicated and not romantic, and mostly it meant being tired in the bones and keeping moving anyway. At kilometer 9, the tube collapsed. Not catastrophically. A section ahead of them, maybe 15 meters of the tube floor, had given way into a lower chamber. The gap was 4 meters across at its narrowest. The lower chamber was dark and its depth was, per LEONARD's best estimate, approximately 6 meters. "Bridge it or go around," Marco said. "No way around," Priya said, studying her display. The collapse event was recent. The geological data shows this section was passable as of the last survey scanned 6 months ago. "So we bridge it." The bridging material available to them consisted of their survey equipment poles, which could be linked to a maximum span of about 2 meters, their climbing cable, which was rated to 600 kilograms and was about 20 meters long, and whatever creative interpretation of physics they could bring to bear. They built a bridge in 40 minutes. It was not a good bridge. It was an adequate bridge. 3 extended equipment poles lashed together with climbing cable, anchored on their side by driving the pole ends into cracks in the tube wall, bridged to the far side by the simple and somewhat terrifying method of Marco walking out onto the poles to the point where his weight began to tip the free end down, allowing it to catch a ledge on the far side. Marco did not appear to find this terrifying. Marco had, by this point, an expression of fixed determination that Dario recognized from 11 months of working with the man. It was the expression Marco wore when he had decided to simply get through something. The expression that acknowledged the situation was bad without giving the situation any more power over him than it had already taken. They crossed in pairs, 2 people at a time on the bridge, which swayed and creaked with that particular metallic groan that makes every human vertebra in proximity briefly reconsider its life choices. All 7 of them made it across. Priya crossed last, still watching her wrist display, cataloging the collapse data because she was, at her core, a scientist, and the fact of being in a collapsing lava tube system under an alien arthropod migration was not going to stop her from noting that the collapse pattern was interesting. "The collapse was stress-induced," she said, as she stepped off the bridge. "The swarm's surface vibration, the mass loading of 4,000 individuals per square kilometer generates a resonance frequency that—" "Priya," Dario said. "Right," she said, moving. They came up at kilometer 28 because the tube network ended there, not at a fissure or a chamber, but at a wall of consolidated basalt that LEONARD's sonar read as solid for at least 30 meters in every direction. No way through. They would have to surface. Priya checked the swarm's projected position against their own. "We're past the southern terminus. The swarm is behind us." "How far behind?" "The trailing edge should be," she calculated, "approximately 4 kilometers north of our current position, probably, given the swarm's velocity variance." "Probably. It's the best I've got." Dario found the surface fissure by going back 300 meters, and finding a crack in the tube, sealing that LEONARD read as connecting to a surface vent. The crack was not comfortable. It was, in fact, precisely the kind of geological feature that makes claustrophobia a very rational response to the universe. But it led up, and up led out, and they went. They emerged into late afternoon on Kethara 9, 300 meters south of where they needed to be and 4 kilometers from the trailing edge of a swarm that was, blessedly, moving away from them. The sky was deep blue in the south. In the north, the darkness of the migration was visible at the horizon, a line that divided the planet into what had been and what was. Between them and the Borealis, approximately 42 kilometers of open ground and 2 hours of usable daylight. They started walking. The Borealis was there. This was the first surprise. The hull was pitted. Acid spray had hit it in a dozen places, some of them significant. The polymer sheeting scored and discolored. One of the secondary sensor arrays gone entirely, but it was there, and it was not breached. And when Dario ran his access key against the entry panel, the panel lit up green. "She's pressurized," he said. "Hull integrity is 72%, LEONARD said. The acid penetration on the portaft section reached approximately 60% of hull thickness at the deepest point. Structural integrity is compromised, but we can lift." "You can lift. I would not recommend extended transit. The hull requires repair before the Borealis is rated for deep space operations." "We don't need deep space. We need altitude and a stable orbit until the rescue ship gets here." "Then yes, you can do that." Dario stood on the landing ramp and looked out at the plain behind them, at the marks in the dirt where 4,000 individuals per square kilometer had passed over this ground for 41 hours and then moved on, leaving a landscape that looked like something had tried very hard to consume it and had, in the end, simply passed through. The way weather passes through. The way time passes through. His crew came up the ramp behind him, one after another. Priya, with her samples, which she had somehow maintained possession of through 32 kilometers of lava tubes, and one improvised bridge and one near chemical ambush, and one long walk across open ground. Marco with both boots laced, finally. Dolores with her atmospheric sensor pack already running a fresh data collection sweep, because apparently Dolores never stopped working. The hummingbird was still in his helmet pocket. He put his hand on it briefly before he followed the crew inside. Incident Report 23 was the one with the attached note from the VETH Survey Coordination Committee member who had reviewed it, a senior archivist named Kethvas 14, whose secondary designation translated approximately as the one who noticed things others preferred not to notice. The note read in full: 7 Terran biological entities survived extended exposure to a Class 9 predator migration event on Kethara 9 by means of subsurface transit through an unmapped geological network, improvised chemical deterrence using repurposed atmospheric survey equipment, improvised structural engineering using available survey materials, extended bipedal transit across post-migration terrain, and what the crew's incident debrief describes as just walking until we got there. Entity designated Reyes, Dario, mission lead, de facto, was asked in the debrief at what point he had considered the possibility of mission failure. His response, as recorded: "I figured we'd figure something out." When pressed for elaboration, he produced a small degraded photograph from his helmet's physical storage compartment and said, "I had something to get back to." Attached are the crew's suit sensor logs, Priya Chandrasekharan's geological survey data, which she continued collecting throughout the incident, and the spectrometer emission data from Dolores Washington's improvised pheromone synthesis. I note for the record that the chemical synthesis performed by Washington was, according to the xenobiochemistry team that reviewed it, almost certainly not accurate enough to have triggered a genuine Yanemoru apex predator alarm response in a krat beetle colony. The pheromone profile was approximate. However, the colony scattered regardless. When the xenobiochemistry team reviewed the sensor logs more carefully, they determined that what had likely triggered the scatter response was not the pheromone accuracy, but the concentration level. Washington had pumped the signal at approximately 8 times the naturally occurring threshold, which had apparently overwhelmed the colony's assessment circuitry regardless of the specific signal identity. This is not a technique described in any xenobiochemistry literature we are aware of, because the standard approach to alien pheromone mimicry is accuracy. The idea of substituting accuracy with raw intensity to achieve the same outcome had, apparently, not occurred to any surveyor or biochemist who had worked on krat beetle evasion protocols. When informed of this, Washington responded, "I figured if I couldn't smell exactly right, I could at least smell really loud." I continue to recommend reclassification of Terran biological entities. They are not a class 2 provisional. They are something else. I do not yet have a classification for what they are. In the classroom on Observation Node 7, Voss Threnar 11 finished the lecture on Maw Beasts of Drell. It moved to the front of the membrane and let the silence sit for a moment. Then it said, "There will be time in the advanced curriculum to discuss Terrans. For now, are there any questions on the Maw Beast evasion protocols?" The small student with the translucent carapace raised one manipulator limb. What did the Terrans do when the rescue ship arrived, after Cathara 9? Voss Threnar 11 studied the student. They filed their survey report, it said. The survey report included complete geological mapping of an 11-kilometer lava tube network, an atmospheric spectral analysis of the Cathara 9 lower stratosphere, and preliminary data on the krat beetle migration pattern that our own survey teams had never successfully obtained. The geological data has been used by 3 separate colonial assessment teams since then. They filed the report, the student said slowly. After all of that, they filed the geological report. Entity Chandrasekharan's notes in the incident debrief indicate that she did not wish the sample collection to have been pointless. A long pause. The one who asks too many questions said very carefully, "What classification are they now, in the new codex?" Voss Threnar 11 was quiet for a moment that stretched into something that the older Veth would have recognized as a specific kind of silence, the kind that precedes not a correction but an admission. "The classification review is ongoing," it said, "but the committee's working recommendation is not finalized." Instructor. Voss Threnar 11 made the chemical equivalent of a long exhale. "The working recommendation of the Classification Review Committee," it said, "is Class 5 active, with a notation." What's the notation? Handle with uncertainty. The membrane was quiet. Outside the node's observation window, the stars turned on their ancient courses, indifferent and constant and very far away. "Why uncertainty?" the small student asked. "Because," Voss Threnar 11 said, with the precise weight of a teacher who has spent a very long time thinking about a very short answer, "they do not respond to predators the way predators expect. They do not fight the way soldiers fight. They do not run the way prey runs. They encounter a problem and they sit down and they think, and then they do something that has not been done before, and then they get up and they walk and they keep walking and they..." It paused. "They file the report," it finished, "and then they go home." The small student was quiet for a long moment. "That does not sound like a Class 5 active," it said. "No," Voss Threnar 11 agreed, "it does not." The lesson moved on to Classification 3. But later, in the maintenance corridor outside the node, the small student caught up with the maintenance Veth whose hatch brother had been on Cathara 9, and asked, "When the rescue ship had arrived, when the Terran crew had been brought aboard, when the debrief was over and the medical checks were done, what had they done then? The maintenance Veth considered this. It was not a philosophical creature by nature. It maintained pressure seals and recalibrated atmospheric processors, and it did its work well. But its hatch brother had told it this part, had specifically mentioned this part because it had stuck with him, and so it told the student. They ate, it said, all 7 of them together. The food was not good rescue ship rations, the kind you eat because you have to, and they sat together and they ate it and they talked, not about what had happened, about other things, small things, the kind of things you talk about when you are very glad to be somewhere talking. The small student absorbed this. And then one of them, the one who led them, he took out a photograph. A small photograph, physical medium, badly degraded from the trip through the tubes, and he looked at it for a long time, and then he put it back. And then he said, the maintenance Veth paused, trying to recall the translation exactly as his hatch brother had given it. He said, I need to call my kid. The small student was quiet for a while. Call his offspring, it said finally. After all of that, that was the first thing he wanted to do. That was the first thing, the maintenance Veth agreed. The small student thought about predators, about migration fronts and acid spray and lava tubes and 32 kilometers walked in the dark, about a photograph kept in a helmet pocket where it had no right to survive. It thought about what the instructor had said. Handle with uncertainty. It thought about the question it had asked at the start of the lesson, the one that had gotten the instructor to change the subject, the one about the locked file and the 47 entries. It thought about how the answer to what kind of predator had turned out not to be the right question at all. The right question, it was beginning to understand, was something the classification system had never been designed to ask. Not what kind of predator, but what kind of creature sits in the dark under an alien swarm and says, I'll figure something out, and then does, and then gets up, and then goes home. The maintenance Veth moved on to the next pressure seal. The small student stood in the corridor for a moment longer, thinking. Then it went back to class. The codex entry that Vosthren R11 had been avoiding for 3 curriculum cycles was not, strictly speaking, locked. That was the word the students used, the locked file, because the entry required senior-level clearance to access in full, and senior-level clearance was not something 6th cycle students possessed. But Vosthren R11 had senior-level clearance, had possessed it for 11 cycles, had in fact been the one to recommend the file's restricted status in the first place, 14 cycles ago, after reviewing the initial set of Terran contact reports, and experiencing something that the Veth biochemical vocabulary had no clean term for, the closest approximation being a secondary resonance state that the old Veth called, roughly, the feeling of looking into deep water and not being able to tell how deep. The entry was not locked. Vosthren R11 chose not to access it in class because the entry contained 47 incident reports, and 23 of them ended the same way, and the way they ended had never stopped being difficult to present to students. The way they ended was, the humans survived. Not always cleanly, not without cost. Several reports included significant injuries. One included a fatality that had nothing to do with the alien threat, and everything to do with a structural failure the humans had not been able to prevent. But in 23 of 47 documented encounters with predators at Class 7 or above, predators that the Veth survey protocols classified as absolute evacuation scenarios, predators that had depopulated colonial sites, predators whose evolutionary specialization was the detection and destruction of biological material. 23 out of 47 Terran contact events had resolved with the humans intact, and in a disturbing number of cases, with the Terrans having generated usable survey data from the encounter itself. 11 of those cases involved the humans deliberately remaining in the threat zone, after the standard evacuation window. Not because they were trapped, because they chose to. This was the part that Voss Thren R11 found most difficult to translate into sixth cycle pedagogy. The Veth survival model was sophisticated and successful. It had been refined over thousands of cycles by species that were, by most measurable criteria, far more biologically robust than humans, better sensory arrays, better environmental tolerances, better natural defenses. The model's core principle was elegant. Assess the threat, calculate the survival probability, execute the protocol that maximizes that probability. If the probability falls below the threshold, evacuate. The threshold was not zero. It was a calculated number, derived from actuarial data, which represented the point at which continued engagement consumed more resources than a successful outcome could justify. Humans, as best Voss Thren R11 could determine after 14 cycles of study, did not appear to use a threshold. What they appeared to use was something that the Terran language called, variously, the situation, the circumstances, what we're working with, and what we've got. These phrases appeared across the incident reports with striking consistency, usually attributed to the individual identified as the crew lead, usually spoken at the moment when the standard protocol had been exhausted and the humans were deciding what to do instead. In the Borealis incident, Entity Rays had used the phrase "I figured we'd figure something out," which was either the most circular reasoning Voss Thren R11 had ever encountered or a profoundly accurate description of a cognitive strategy that the Veth classification system had no language for. What had actually happened, between the lava tube emergence and the filing of the survey report, was this. After the 7 crew members of the Borealis emerged from the eastern ridge fissure and assessed their position, they had a 42-kilometer walk ahead of them across post-migration terrain. Post-migration terrain on Ketharanine was not the same as pre-migration terrain. The swarm had passed through it. The ground was marked. Some of the vegetation, thin, gray-green ground cover, mostly, the kind that hadn't evolved to be very interesting because being interesting attracted things you didn't want attracted, had been dissolved or crushed flat. The air had an edge to it, a mineral chemical sharpness that was the dissipated residue of 4,000 acid glands per square kilometer having operated for 41 hours over this ground. Dolores ran continuous atmospheric checks throughout the walk. The acid residue was not at dangerous concentration levels by the time they were moving through it. It was at nuisance levels, the kind that stung the eyes if your visor was up, that left a faint taste in the back of the throat that Priya described as like licking a battery, and Marco described as something less printable. They walked with visors down for the first 3 kilometers, and then Dolores cleared the air, and they walked the rest of it with visors up because the suit reserves needed to last. The terrain was flat in the way that things are flat after something very large has moved across them. Even the rocks were different. Some of them scored. Some of them dissolved at the edges into shapes that looked deliberately artistic, the way acid erosion often did, and Priya kept noting this in her wrist data log because she was constitutionally incapable of not noting it. They walked in pairs and then in groups and then, as the kilometers accumulated, in the staggered formation of people who are tired enough that maintaining conversational distance becomes impractical, which is to say, close together, occasionally bumping shoulders, occasionally catching someone's arm when the ground was uneven. Dario walked at the front most of the time. Occasionally he dropped back to check on crew members, and occasionally crew members drifted up to walk with him for a while, not always speaking, sometimes just maintaining proximity in the way that people do when they have been through something together, and proximity itself is meaningful. At kilometer 20, Marco produced, from somewhere in his survey kit, a battered sealed thermal container that turned out to contain coffee. Not good coffee. Emergency-grade ship's coffee, the kind that was technically coffee in the same way that emergency rations were technically food, but hot. And real, in the sense that it was a real thing that a real person had packed against the possibility of needing it, which Marco had done on every field assignment for 11 months because Marco's personal theory, stated on multiple occasions, was that you could get through anything if you had something warm to drink at the halfway point. There was exactly enough for 7 small cups. They stopped walking for the duration of the coffee. They stood on the acid-scored plain of Catharinine under an alien sky that was darkening toward its equivalent of evening, and they drank it. "This is terrible," Priya said, with sincere appreciation. "It's the good stuff," Marco said. "I save it for survival situations." "You always bring this." "I always survive." Dario held his cup in both hands and looked at the horizon to the north, where the trailing edge of the swarm had long since passed beyond visual range. The sky in that direction was ordinary now, blue deepening to purple. 2 of Catharinine's 3 moons were visible, pale and low, the smaller one already setting. "How many samples did you get?" he asked Priya. She held up the sample kit. It was, somehow, completely intact. Sealed, labeled in her precise handwriting. Her suit's haptic annotation system had apparently been running the entire time, logging everything, because Priya ran her annotation system continuously in the field, the way other people ran breathing. 47, she said. "I lost 2 when we did the bridge crossing. The basalt from the deep tube wall collapse section is going to be interesting. Those are geological formations that nobody has dated yet. And the krat beetle bioresin I scraped from the chamber walls after they scattered, that might be useful to the xenobiochemistry team for the pheromone work." Dario looked at her. "You scraped samples while we were crossing a chamber full of krat beetles." "There was a moment," she said. "There was a moment," he repeated. "I was very quick about it." He looked at his coffee. He looked at the sky. He did not say anything for several seconds. Then he said, "Put it in the report." "Obviously," Priya said. They finished the coffee and walked the last 22 kilometers. The rescue ship was a Terran Colonial Support Authority vessel called the Meridian, and it arrived in Catharinine orbit 14 hours after the Borealis achieved stable altitude on emergency hull. The Meridian's medical team was efficient. The Borealis crew was examined, treated Marco's minor chemical irritation to his left hand from a moment of suit breach during the bridge construction, Dolores's stress fracture in her right ankle that she had not mentioned to anyone during the walk, Priya's dehydration which she had managed with characteristic precision down to the exact point where she was still functional, and then fed, and then debriefed, and then allowed to rest. The debrief officer was a woman named Harrington, who had the specific manner of someone who had done enough incident debriefs to have stopped being surprised by human beings, but had not stopped being interested in them. She took their statements methodically, from each crew member in sequence, and she asked follow-up questions that were precise and useful and did not waste anyone's time. When she reached Dario, she asked him the question that the Veth archivist Keth Voss 14 would later note in the locked file. "At what point did you consider the possibility that the mission would fail?" Dario thought about the lava tube. He thought about the collapsed section and the makeshift bridge. He thought about the chamber with the beetles and the moment before Dolores fired the spectrometer, when the outcome had genuinely been unknown. He thought about the 42-kilometer walk in thinning air with suit reserves running down and coffee at the halfway point. He took the photograph out of his helmet pocket. The trip through the tubes had done it no favors. The image was blurred at the edges, the paper soft with humidity. But the hummingbird was still there, in the background of the image, on the wall of the kitchen in his daughter's drawing, the wings not quite symmetrical, the colors slightly outside the lines, the very specific imperfection of a 7-year-old's best effort. "I figured we'd figure something out," he said. Harrington wrote this down, She looked at it for a moment, then she looked at him. "Did you," she said, "figure something out?" He thought about Dolores's spectrometer, about Priya's geological data running even in the dark, about Marco's thermal coffee container, packed every time for 11 months against the possibility of needing it. "We usually do," he said. Harrington looked at him for a moment with the expression of someone cataloging a thing they don't have a box for yet. Then she moved to the next page of her debrief form. The survey report that Priya Chandrasekaran filed was 43 pages. It covered the geological composition of the Eastern Ridge Tube network in detail sufficient for any future survey team to map and use it. It covered the atmospheric composition of the Catharinine lower stratosphere at ground level during an active migration event, which was data that no previous survey had obtained because no previous survey team had been present during a migration event and declined to leave. It covered the spectrographic analysis of the krat beetle bioresin samples, which the xenobiochemistry team at the Colonial Survey Bureau would later use to develop the first practical krat beetle pheromone evasion kit, a kit that subsequently allowed 3 separate colonial assessment teams to safely evaluate Catharinine during migration season, directly enabling the agricultural colonial expansion that the Borealis had been originally sent to assess. The kit was eventually certified by the Interspecies Survey Exchange for general sale to all survey-capable species operating in the inner arm. The VETH Survey Coordination Committee purchased 300 units in the first 6 months. The certification documentation listed the development team. In the acknowledgments, the xenobiochemistry team's lead researcher had written, "This work would not have been possible without the field data obtained by the crew of the GSS Borealis during the Catharinine migration event, and in particular without the creative application of sensor hardware by crew member D. Washington, who demonstrated that in the absence of precise knowledge, sufficiency at high intensity is a valid engineering philosophy." Dolores Washington read this once, set the citation notice aside, and went back to her atmospheric sensor calibration, which she had been meaning to finish for 3 weeks. When VOS-3 R11 finally received its updated curriculum materials, the revised Xenobiological Survey Curriculum, 3rd edition, approved by the Galactic Survey Coordination Committee after considerable debate, there was a new section. Not a locked file section, an open one. Section 14, Terran Contact Protocols. The section was brief. It occupied 4 pages of the curriculum materials. Its opening line had been drafted by the Classification Review Committee after 14 sessions and considerable disagreement, and it read, "Terran biological entities are classified as Class 5 active. Contact protocols are as follows: standard diplomatic approach, full disclosure of threat parameters, and the provision of whatever materials and information the Terran crew requests. Experience indicates that Terran crews provided with complete information about a threat situation will, with high probability, develop a response to that situation that is not currently cataloged in VETH survey protocols. Experience also indicates that attempting to limit Terran information access in the interest of preventing inadvisable engagement will not prevent inadvisable engagement. It will merely cause the Terrans to work with less information. This is considered suboptimal." The second paragraph read, "Survey teams operating in proximity to Terran crews are advised to maintain an observer log throughout any shared threat scenario. Terran problem-solving approaches have, on multiple occasions, yielded methodologies subsequently adopted into standard VETH survey protocols. The pheromone intensity substitution approach, the improvised geological anchor bridge technique, and the post-migration terrain transit routing methodology are all now listed in Appendix 7. The third paragraph read, "Finally, and for reasons that the committee debated at length before concluding that clarity served better than dignity, If a Terran survey crew has decided to remain in a threat zone that you have already evacuated, do not attempt to dissuade them. File your incident report from a safe distance. They will, in most cases, emerge. They will want medical attention, possibly food, and, in a statistically significant number of documented cases, access to a communication device to contact their offspring or bonded partners. Provide these things. Then ask them what happened. Take careful notes. Vostren R11 read the section 3 times. It thought about the small student with the translucent carapace. It thought about the maintenance vet's hatch brother on Kethara 9, watching 7 humans walk out of a migration zone that should have been unsurvivable, carrying their geological samples and their coffee containers and their photographs. It thought about a 7-year-old's hummingbird, slightly imperfect, outside the lines, still there after everything. It updated its curriculum notes. The notation it added to its personal teaching file, which no student would see, was 4 words. It read, "They take their samples."